Before we unveil the mystery that consumed Pennington Hall, I need you to understand something. This isn't just another ghost story. This is about how beauty, obsession, and secrets can destroy an entire legacy. If you're intrigued by tales where reality becomes stranger than fiction, stay with me through to the end. In the autumn of 1873, the coastal town of Pennington Harbor, Massachusetts, stood as a monument to old money and older secrets. The town's prosperity flowed from whaling fortunes made decades earlier, and its social hierarchy remained as rigid as the granite cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. Pennington Hall dominated the highest point in town, a Gothic mansion of 40 rooms built by shipping magnate Cornelius Pennington in 1845. Now, in 1873, it housed his grandson, Richard Pennington III, a man of 35 whose inherited wealth exceeded his inherited wisdom. Richard's wife, Victoria, came from Boston's most distinguished families. Beautiful, educated, and utterly bored with her role as a society matron, she filled her days with charitable committees and her nights with laudanum-laced sleep. Their marriage, like most in their circle, was a merger of fortunes rather than hearts. The disruption began on a gray October morning when Richard hired a new music instructor for their 16-year-old daughter, Constance. Professor Adrian Thorne arrived at Pennington Hall with impeccable references from European conservatories. He was perhaps 28, with features so refined they seemed almost unreal. Pale skin, dark hair that fell across his forehead, eyes of an unusual violet gray that seemed to change color in different light. His first lesson with young Constance lasted 2 hours. When Victoria heard her daughter playing Chopin with a passion she'd never displayed before, she went to observe. What she saw in the music room made her pause in the doorway. Constance sat at the grand piano, her face flushed with concentration, while Professor Thorne stood behind her, his long fingers occasionally reaching over her shoulder to demonstrate a technique. There was nothing improper in the scene, and yet Victoria felt something stir in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. When the lesson ended, Victoria found herself inviting Professor Thorne to take tea with the family. During their conversation, she discovered he was well-read, thoughtful, and possessed of opinions that challenged her assumptions about art, literature, and life itself. "Most people hear music," he said, his strange eyes fixed on hers, "but they don't truly listen. They don't let it transform them. Transformation requires vulnerability, Mrs. Pennington. Most of us are too afraid to be vulnerable." That night, Victoria dismissed her laudanum bottle. For the first time in months, she lay awake thinking, really thinking, about her life, her choices, her carefully constructed prison of respectability. Within 2 weeks, Professor Thorne had become indispensable to Pennington Hall. Beyond Constance's piano lessons, he was invited to dinner parties where his conversation enchanted guests. He accompanied the family to concerts. He was asked to advise on which paintings to acquire for Richard's growing art collection. If this story is unsettling you already, wait until you hear what happened next. The true horror hadn't even begun. Victoria's closest friend, Margaret Ashford, visited Pennington Hall for afternoon tea and met Professor Thorne. Within an hour of conversation, Margaret's usual sharp wit had softened into something else entirely. She began finding excuses to visit daily. Then Eleanor Blackwood, a widow of impeccable reputation, attended a dinner where Professor Thorne discussed Dante's Inferno with such passion that she sat transfixed, her food untouched. She commissioned him to give her private Italian lessons. By November, Professor Thorne had attracted the attention of no fewer than 8 women from Pennington Harbor's elite families. All were intelligent, accomplished, respectable. All suddenly became devoted to music, art, literature, any pursuit that gave them access to the professor's company. The men of Pennington Harbor noticed, and their reactions ranged from amusement to concern to something darker. Richard Pennington himself seemed oblivious, pleased that his household had become such a cultural center. But Dr. James Whitmore, the town physician and Richard's closest friend, pulled him aside after one particularly animated dinner party. "Richard, I must speak plainly. Your wife and half the women in town are behaving strangely. This Professor Thorne, there's something about him that isn't natural." "Jealousy doesn't suit you, James," Richard laughed. "The man is educated and cultured. Of course people enjoy his company." "It's beyond enjoyment. It's obsession. Mrs. Ashford came to my office claiming insomnia because she can't stop thinking about a conversation she had with him 3 days ago. Eleanor Blackwood has stopped attending church because Sunday mornings conflict with her Italian lessons. And Victoria, Richard, when was the last time you saw your wife this animated, this alive?" Richard's smile faded. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that something is wrong, and if you don't address it, this situation will spiral into scandal." That night, Richard observed his wife more carefully. She was different, her eyes brighter, her movements more graceful, her conversation more engaged. She spoke enthusiastically about a book Professor Thorne had recommended, her hands gesturing as she described its themes. When had Victoria last been enthusiastic about anything? The transformation should have pleased him. Instead, it filled him with unease. The breaking point came on a cold December evening. Richard returned home early from his gentleman's club to find Victoria in the music room with Professor Thorne. They were not touching. They were not even standing particularly close. Victoria sat on the window seat while the professor played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata on the piano. But the expression on his wife's face as she watched him play, raw, unguarded longing, struck Richard like a physical blow. He cleared his throat, and Victoria started, color flooding her cheeks. "Richard, I didn't hear you come in." "Clearly." He turned to Professor Thorne. "It's rather late for a music lesson, don't you think?" "I was playing for my own enjoyment, sir. Mrs. Pennington was kind enough to indulge my need for an audience." The professor's voice remained calm, respectful, utterly proper. "Nevertheless, I believe our arrangement has run its course. Your services are no longer required." Victoria stood abruptly. "Richard, you can't—" "I can, and I have." He kept his voice level, though fury roiled beneath the surface. "Professor Thorne, you'll be compensated through the end of the month. Please collect your belongings." What happened next would be discussed in whispers for decades. Professor Thorne gathered his sheet music without protest, but as he prepared to leave, Victoria did something unthinkable. She followed him into the entrance hall, in full view of the household staff. "Adrian, please," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Don't go." The professor turned, and for just a moment Something flickered in his unusual eyes. Pity, perhaps, or sorrow. "Mrs. Pennington, you don't want me to stay. You want an escape from the life you've built. I cannot be that for you. No one can be that for you. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You've mistaken awakening for love, possibility for passion. But I'm just a mirror, Mrs. Pennington. What you see in me is only what you're not allowing yourself to be." He left then, walking out into the December snow, leaving Victoria standing in the entrance hall, with tears streaming down her face, and 3 servants pretending they hadn't witnessed her humiliation. Richard expected the matter to end there. He was catastrophically wrong. The next morning, Margaret Ashford appeared at Pennington Hall, demanding to know where Professor Thorne had gone. "He's been dismissed," Richard said curtly. "The arrangement was inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" Margaret's voice rose. "He was the only person in this suffocating town who treated me like I had a mind worth engaging. You had no right." "I had every right. He was employed by my household." That afternoon, Eleanor Blackwood came, then Sarah Morrison, then Catherine Webb. One after another, women who'd never been particularly friendly with Victoria suddenly became allied in their fury at Richard for dismissing Professor Thorne. By evening, Richard received an unexpected visit from Thomas Ashford, Margaret's husband. "Where is he?" Thomas demanded, his face flushed with alcohol and anger. "Where's the man who's bewitched my wife?" "He's gone. I dismissed him yesterday." She cried all night. My wife of 20 years cried over a music teacher she's known for 6 weeks. What kind of devil was he? "He was just a man," Richard said, though he was no longer certain that was true. Dr. Whitmore arrived shortly after, summoned by the sound of raised voices. He found Richard in his study, head in his hands. "It's worse than I thought," Richard said. "They're all mad. Every woman who spent time with him has become irrational." "Where did he go?" "I don't know. He didn't say." "We need to find him," Whitmore said grimly. "We need answers about what he did to them." "He did nothing. That's what's driving me insane. He was always proper, always respectful. He simply talked to them, listened to them, saw them as more than decorative objects, and somehow that was enough to destroy their peace of mind." Whitmore was silent for a long moment. "Then perhaps the problem isn't him, Richard. Perhaps the problem is us, the life we've created for these women, where simple human recognition feels like enchantment." The search for Professor Thorne consumed the next 3 days. He'd left no forwarding address. The boarding house where he'd stayed was paid through the month, but his room was empty. Even his references, when Richard finally investigated them thoroughly, proved to be real but vague. Yes, and Adrian Thorne had studied at those conservatories, but the dates were unclear, and no one could quite remember what he looked like. It was as if he'd been a ghost all along. Meanwhile, the women of Pennington Harbor descended into various forms of crisis. Margaret Ashford stopped eating, growing gaunt and pale, claiming that food had no taste anymore. Eleanor Blackwood locked herself in her music room, playing the same pieces Professor Thorne had taught her, over and over, until her fingers bled. Victoria withdrew into silence, moving through Pennington Hall like a phantom, barely acknowledging her husband or daughter. And young Constance, whose piano lessons had started it all, sat at her window for hours, watching the road, waiting for a return that would never come. Dr. Whitmore, faced with multiple patients exhibiting similar symptoms, consulted medical journals and colleagues. What he found disturbed him. "There are documented cases," he told Richard, "of mass hysteria, usually in isolated communities, shared delusions, collective obsessions, but they're typically triggered by stress, fear, or religious fervor. I've never heard of one triggered by a single charismatic individual." So what do we do? Wait. Distance and time should break the spell. Without his presence to sustain it, their obsession should fade. But before healing could begin, the situation took a darker turn. On a freezing night in late December, a fire broke out in the Ashford mansion. By the time it was extinguished, the library, where Margaret had spent most of her time since Professor Thorne's departure, was destroyed. Margaret survived, but was found in her nightgown in the snowy garden, clutching a single sheet of music to her chest, mumbling about having to destroy it all before the beauty killed her. She was quietly committed to an asylum in Providence. The town held its breath, waiting for the next catastrophe. The truth about Professor Adrian Thorne emerged not through investigation, but through an unexpected letter. It arrived at Pennington Hall in mid-January, addressed to Victoria in an elegant hand. Richard intercepted it. He'd been monitoring all correspondence, and opened it without shame. Privacy seemed less important than preventing another tragedy. The letter was from a woman named Celeste Dumont, writing from New Orleans. "Dear Mrs. Pennington, I write to you as one who has walked the path you now travel. 2 years ago, a man calling himself Adrian Thorne came to New Orleans as an art instructor. Within months, he had devastated our community in precisely the way I suspect he has devastated yours. 7 marriages ended. 3 women were institutionalized. 1 took her own life, all because we could not understand what he was or what he represented. I have since learned that he appears every few years in different cities under different names, always in cultural roles: music teacher, art instructor, poet, philosopher, always leaving destruction in his wake. Who is he? I believe he is no one and everyone, a mirror that reflects our deepest dissatisfactions, a catalyst that exposes the lies we tell ourselves about our contentment. He does nothing improper, casts no spells, employs no manipulation. He simply exists, and his existence poses a question we cannot bear to answer. If this stranger can make me feel alive, what does that say about the life I've chosen? The women who survive his presence face a terrible choice: blame him for bewitching us, or accept that we were already desperate, already dying inside, already yearning for someone to see us as complete human beings rather than ornamental wives and mothers. Most choose blame. It's easier than accepting responsibility for our own unhappiness. But you still have time to choose differently. The obsession will fade, Mrs. Pennington. The question is what you'll do with the clarity that follows. Yours in understanding, Celeste Dumont. Richard read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing new discomfort. Because Celeste Dumont was right, Professor Thorne had done nothing wrong. He'd simply been himself, and that self had revealed how profoundly unfulfilled the women of Pennington Harbor truly were. The real monster wasn't the music teacher. It was the gilded cage of expectations and limitations that had made his simple humanity feel like magic. Richard brought the letter to Dr. Whitmore, who read it with growing recognition. "She's describing a psychological phenomenon," Whitmore said. "We see it sometimes in medical practice, patients who fall in love with their doctors, not because of anything the doctor does, but because the doctor represents care, attention, being seen as a whole person. In a society where women are trained to be decorative and silent, a man who actually listens and responds intellectually becomes intoxicating." "So we created this," Richard said bitterly. "By building a world where women are ornaments, we made them vulnerable to anyone who treats them as human." "Yes, though I doubt most men will accept that conclusion." They were right to doubt. When Richard attempted to share his insight with other husbands, suggesting that they had contributed to their wives' distress by treating them as possessions rather than partners, he was met with hostility. "My wife has everything she could want," Thomas Ashford snapped. "If she's ungrateful, that's her failing, not mine." But a few men listened. A very few began making changes, small at first, but genuine. They asked their wives' opinions on matters beyond household management. They discussed books and ideas at dinner instead of just business. They acknowledged that their partners might have inner lives as complex as their own. The recovery was slow and uneven. Margaret Ashford remained institutionalized, her mind unable to reconcile the woman she'd become during those brief weeks with the woman she was expected to be. Eleanor Blackwood moved to New York, where she opened a music school for girls, determined to give young women the education and validation she'd discovered too late. Victoria and Richard's marriage survived, but was fundamentally altered. Richard gave Victoria access to the family finances and encouraged her to pursue actual interests rather than performative charity. She began attending lectures at Boston University, eventually auditing courses in literature and philosophy. Their relationship became a genuine partnership, though it took years to rebuild trust. Young Constance went to study at a conservatory in Vienna, refusing to return to Pennington Harbor. She eventually married a composer and built a life that scandalized her relatives but satisfied her soul. As for Professor Adrian Thorne, he vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared. Reports surfaced occasionally: a charismatic philosophy tutor in Charleston, an art instructor in San Francisco, always leaving the same pattern of awakening and destruction. Dr. Whitmore became obsessed with documenting the phenomenon, corresponding with physicians in other cities, collecting accounts of similar occurrences. He published a paper in a medical journal about collective romantic hysteria, though it was largely dismissed by his colleagues as sensationalism. In his private notes, however, he wrote something more honest. "We have built a society that treats half its population as beautiful objects rather than thinking beings. We deny women education, autonomy, and purpose, then wonder why they become obsessed with anyone who momentarily makes them feel human. Adrian Thorne, or whatever his real name is not a monster. He's a symptom, and we are the disease." Pennington Hall stood for another 70 years before being torn down in the 1940s, but the music room was abandoned long before that. Victoria could never enter it again without remembering how it felt to be truly seen, truly heard, truly alive, and how brief and painful that awakening had been. The town of Pennington Harbor recovered its equilibrium, at least superficially. The scandal was buried under years of silence, mentioned only in whispers, if at all. Official records from that winter make no mention of the series of crises that nearly destroyed the town's most prominent families. But the legacy persisted in subtle ways. Daughters were sent away for education more frequently. Women's charitable organizations began focusing on actual social reform rather than performative gentility. A few marriages ended quietly, replaced by arrangements that allowed both partners more freedom. The questions Professor Thorne had raised, whether by design or simply by existing, couldn't be entirely silenced. What does it mean to be alive versus merely existing? What happens when we mistake recognition for love? And what does it say about our society when simple human dignity feels like enchantment? These questions haunted Pennington Harbor long after the man who'd embodied them disappeared into obscurity. Some said he died young, his unusual beauty fading into ordinary mortality. Others claimed he was still out there, appearing in new cities under new names, a perpetual mirror reflecting society's failures back at itself. The truth, like so much of his story, remained ambiguous. But Victoria Pennington, in the final years of her life, wrote a private memoir that was discovered after her death in 1924. In it, she offered her own conclusion. Adrian Thorne showed me that I was dying by inches in my beautiful prison. For that, I hated him. For that, I was grateful to him. For that, I have never fully forgiven myself for needing him to show me what I should have known all along. That a life of comfort without purpose, security without growth, respect without genuine connection is not really life at all. He was not a devil or an angel. He was simply a man who refused to pretend that the prison was paradise, and that honesty, in a world built on comfortable lies, was more destructive than any malice could have been.